Hi everyone. This video is going to be a little bit different because we aren't actually going to be talking about Math 10C today. We're going to be talking about factoring. Now, I sort of have a bit of an issue with the order that things are taught in the Alberta curriculum. The way I learned it, in grade 9 we did everything linear. We did solving linear equations, we did graphing linear things, we did setting up two linear equations on the same graph and finding where they intersect. It's called solutions of linear systems. We did everything to do with straight lines. And then in grade 10, we did everything to do with these curved functions called quadratics. And I'm telling you this right now, we're sort of at the end of our quadratics unit, and you guys don't actually really even know what a quadratic function looks like, which to me is a little bit crazy. And that's just because of the way the Alberta curriculum is set up. And so normally when I teach this in class, as I'm going through, I try to give you guys some context, give you guys some previews for stuff you're going to see in Math 20-1 or Math 20-2. to try to give you guys some understanding of why you should care about all this stuff. And sort of the epitome of this issue is factoring. Factoring is this really sort of strange arcane skill where you go through, you take this quadratic, this trinomial thing, and you look for two numbers that multiply to this, two numbers that add to this, and you sort of split it apart into two things, and you're like, okay, so I've turned my quadratic into two different binomials, but why do I care? And that's a fair question. That's a totally fair question. So I'm going to try to answer that question today. Now, just to clarify, for those of you taking Math 10C in Alberta, none of this is Math 10C material. But I think it's really important for you guys to understand what this is building towards and why you should care about factoring as a skill and why you're going to be using factoring quite a bit for the rest of your high school and, if you're going into it, university mathematics education. For most of you anyway, that do math in university. Okay, so let's just jump right into one example. Let's say we have 0 equals some factored expression. If we have 0 equals x minus 5 times x plus 3. This is an already factored quadratic. And one of the things you're going to learn in grade 11 is something called the zero property. And this is the really cool thing that if you've got two numbers that multiply to 0, that means that one of the two numbers has to be 0. The only number you can multiply by to get 0 is 0 itself. Which means that if you've got a factored expression, then you can see right away that if x was 5, then what's 5 minus 5? 5 minus 5 is 0. And if x is 5 then this whole first binomial is 0. And 0 times anything, it doesn't matter what the second thing is at this point. 0 times anything is 0. And the second thing, I guess, 5 plus 3 is 8. But it doesn't matter because 0 times 8 is just 0, which satisfies, yes, 0. It does equal 0. Now, if we look at our second binomial here, then, what value of x plus 3 would make that second thing 0? Well, negative 3 plus 3 makes this equal to 0. And in this case, negative 3 minus 5 is negative 8. But it doesn't matter because 0 times anything is a 0. And that's the zero property. And so that lets you, once you have a factored form, find what are called the zeros of your quadratic. And so let me just give you another example of why we would care about zeros. Let's say you've got, I don't know, you've got some sort of cannon. And your cannon is not very powerful cannon. We'll see by our equation. Cannon. And it's firing a cannonball. Boom. You like the sound effects? Now, the question is, how long until it hits the ground? Like, how far is this cannonball going to go? And we can actually model and solve this using a quadratic. So if we know that the height of the cannonball is given by negative 5t squared plus 2t plus 3. This says that, as time goes on, it's going to follow this sort of, this arc, this parabola shape. That's the name of this shape, by the way. Then if you can actually model this and solve this with a quadratic. So what you do is you draw yourself a y-axis and you draw yourself an x-axis, right? Because you care about when it hits the ground. And then we can model with the quadratic. Technically, it sort of goes off over here. You're going to get two solutions to this equation. And one of the solutions is going to be the time until it hits the ground. And if you want, you can use the equation I gave you with your grade 10 skills and figure this out. Like, this is a grade 11 application of quadratics question. And it comes from finding the zeros. And one of the easiest ways to find the zeros is by factoring. This comes up in tons of different situations. In Math 31, you do calculus, and calculus is all about finding where curves change their direction and where curves change from, or where functions change from curving up to curving down. And all of these things are based on finding the zeros, finding the solutions to an equation. If you're working in business and you want to know where your break-even point is, if you can model your revenue and you can model your costs, you can get some sort of function. And the zero of that profit function is called your break-even point. If you don't sell enough to get to your break-even point, then you're losing money even for being open. And if you're trying to figure out where to maximize your profit, what's the number of units you want to sell to give you the most possible profit? Well, guess what? Calculus is to the rescue. In Math 30-1, you can learn how to take the derivative of that equation and find the zero. And finding the zeros and finding the solutions are so fundamental for so many different branches of mathematics. And it all comes from this factored form that you guys learned this year, where you take a quadratic and factor it. Another time when we care about this stuff is when we're simplifying expressions. So next year you're going to get things that look a little bit scary. They're called rational expressions. And you're going to get like something that looks like this. Okay, so normal quadratic, not too scary yet, except we're going to divide by a whole other quadratic, x squared plus 10x plus 21. And that thing looks really, complicated and ugly and whatever. But if we actually factor this, it's going to turn out to simplify really nicely for us. So let's factor our first thing. So we need two things that multiply negative 12 and add to negative 1, right? Because that's our, our invisible 1. So 4 times 3 is 12. So our numbers are going to be 4 and 3. And we need the 4 to be negative because we need a negative 1. Okay, the thing underneath we can factor. What are two things that multiply to 21 and add to 10? Well, 7 times 3 is 21, and sure enough, 7 and 3 add to 10. And now this is the magical part. You guys are going to learn, it's a little bit more complicated than this. There's things about dividing by 0 that's going to come in grade 11. But the big idea is the x plus 3 over the x plus 3 can reduce. So this is, roughly speaking, and roughly speaking, you'll learn about the text. But this idea of being able to turn that big, ugly quadratic into a linear is awesome! We just took something that was big and ugly and made it something that was much, much simpler, much more elegant, much easier to understand and graph. And that's simplifying. And there are many, many, many cases where your first step to solving something is factoring. I was just helping another student with Math 30-1. And just last night we ran into this question in Math 30-1, and it was totally unrelated. It's a completely different unit. And to solve it, the very first step that she had to do was factor all the things because she needed to simplify her expressions. It just comes up all the time. It comes up in trig. It comes up in radicals. It comes up all over the place in Math 20-1, Math 30-1 especially, but also Math 20-2, Math 30-2. And so I know this isn't a very, useful video for you guys this year because none of these skills, like finding zeros, you don't need, graphing quadratics, you don't need, and rational expressions is what these fraction things are called, right? Rational numbers like a fraction, these are called rational expressions. And all of this stuff is like Math 20-1, 20-2 material. But I thought it'd be good for you guys to actually know that factoring is a real useful skill. It's not just something we made up for Math 10C to make you guys do fun math Sudoku. This is actually real useful practical math that any of you who go on to do any sort of mathematical modeling, you're probably going to be using this skill quite a bit. Anyway, I hope you like this video and have a good one.